Is Georgia about to turn into the next Ukraine? Hello, my friends, like you here. Welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. And the thing that I just said might sound odd, but in a scene that is reminiscent of the Maidan Revolution back in 2014 in Ukraine, tens of thousands of people joined for what it is at this point, I think like the 18th straight day or 19th at the time that I'm recording this, day of protests in Georgia. This being after the governing party would suspend negotiations on joining the European Union. Along with this, there would be multiple separate demonstrations decrying violence against Georgian journalists as well as citizens. That is something that has been increasingly happening in the varying different rallies around the country. My friends, the story that we're talking about today here is wild because police have been using increasing amounts of force in their attempts to stop demonstrations, which have centered on the parliament building in the capital of Tbilisi. Tbilisi? Oh dear God, I hope that I'm saying that right in the first place. Like, my friends, the scenes that have been coming out of here are absolutely wild. Riot police have been using water cannons and tear gas every single day to try and disperse the rallies, beating scores of protesters who, in response, have been throwing fireworks at police. And no, I'm not kidding when I say that. If you actually go and look at some of the videos, which I'm sure we're going to put up right here, in scenes similar to what you would expect in Warhammer 40k with the orcs, we have Roman candles being fired off like mortars at officers behind barricades that have been built ad hoc by protesters on the Georgian capital's central boulevard. Though protests have been going on for a while, they would only escalate on November 28th, when Prime Minister Irakli Kopakidze would announce that Georgia was going to halt EU accession talks, quote, until the end of 2028. The population, which has been overwhelmingly pro-EU, has in turn taken offense to that, and anti-government demonstrations have since spread to just about every single city, town, and village across the country. Protesters are now demanding a rerun of the October 26 parliamentary elections, which saw the ruling Georgian Dream Party claim victory amidst allegations of vote rigging. Which, that right there is its own thing entirely, and the government response to all of this with protests, like I talk about with the water cannons, has been equally part brutal as well as just insane. Police forces have used truncheons, tear gas, rubber bullets, water cannons, anything and everything they can short of just straight up live ammunition to try and disperse crowds, severely injuring dozens of people and carrying out hundreds of arrests. Meanwhile, the ruling party, Georgian Dream, has rejected calls for any new elections and has attempted to specifically blame the European Union for putting integration on hold and causing riots in the first place. As I said before, this is something that has outraged the population, as generally speaking, the idea of joining the EU is very popular. Over 100 serving Georgian diplomats would go and sign an open letter criticizing the government's move, and several Georgian ambassadors would resign from their posts in response to this. Over the past several weeks, hundreds of people have been arrested in the violence, with prisons in the country, which already had fairly limited capacity in the first place, now overflowing. At this point, when I'm describing this, my friends, it genuinely seems as though we will either see a revolution or a civil war break out within the country, as accusations of Russian interference run rampant. Because yes, Russia appears to be involved in all of this. The question as to how much and how severe all of it is, though, that is up for debate. After their losses in Syria, if they lose here, that would be another massive blow to Russian prestige. The question, though, as always becomes, how the hell did we get here? What is happening in Georgia, and will we see another conflict break out in the Caucasus that will involve Russia once again? Well, my friends, you know exactly how it is that we work here on this channel. Let's go ahead and dive into our story today as we address the very confusing mess that is still currently unfolding in Georgia, and at any point could take a turn for the worse. In fact, even as I make this video right now, and it has to go off to my editor, who knows, this whole thing could just completely get screwed. But, that being said, let's dive in. First off, in order to be able to understand how it is that we got here in the modern day, where everything is so incredibly messy, we need to talk about Georgia itself and the events leading up to the past couple of weeks. Now, when I say this, we're not going to go back too far, but it's important to show Georgia's history and relations with Russia, which, over the centuries, can easily be described as complicated. Because Russia has always kind of interfered with Georgia, something that the Georgians greatly despise. Now, my friends, when I go and describe this, the term Georgians refers to the collective name of a closely related group of people who live in the mountains and plains of southwest Transcaucasia, with varying different names given to the region and the peoples depending upon who is actually going and describing them. The region, though, the Caucasus Mountains, this is something that has been contested by many different great powers over the course of the last 1,000 to 2,000 years. The Romans, the Parthians, the Turks, the Russians, and many more have fought to control the valuable defensive position of the mountains and control the trade lanes running through them. The last great winner of these powers was the Russians, which is why they are so incredibly important to our story today. In 1783, Georgia would go and sign the Treaty of Georgisk and would place itself under the protection of Russia, which over the course of the next several decades and century would annex parts of it, and all of it was incorporated by the mid-19th century. Now, over this time of Russian control, Georgia would largely, for the most part, prosper. The population would increase by 5 times what it was before World War I. And the current-day capital, Tbilisi, would become the center of the Russian administration of the Caucasus and the seat of the viceroy. Oil pipelines and railroads would connect Tbilisi to the ports of Baku, Poti, and Batum, and Georgian and Armenian cultural revivals in the 19th century would specifically start in Tbilisi and serve as their own kind of cultural hub for the region. As time went on, things became somewhat diversified. Russians would control the administration and general governance, the Armenians and their merchants would largely control aspects of the economy, while the Georgians, the everyday people, would be mostly farmers and artisans and were actually the least powerful group in this area. As the 19th century wore on, Russian rule would bring about Western political ideas, as well as the Georgian Social Democrats becoming a major force in Russian politics. Now, this was all well and good, and things were fine and relatively peaceful until World War I went and shattered Russia, leaving it a shell of its former self. This is extremely important to our story, because after the Russian Revolution of February of 1917, the Transcaucasian region was ruled from Petrograd, which now today is St. Petersburg, but that control was only short-lived, and the Bolshevik coup that would take place later that year would force the predominantly Menshevik politicians of Transcaucasia to abandon Russia. They would secede and become independent, and instead form the Transcaucasian Commissariat. Now, what happens when a newly freed people are filled with nationalist zeal and composed of multiple different ethnicities? Infighting. Infighting is usually what we would see, and that's exactly what happened here. Nationalism and other issues would end up breaking down the Transcaucasian Federation during this time, and the states of the area would pursue their own independent nationhood. Within a very short time, on May 26, 1918, Georgia would set up an independent state and would place itself under the protection of Germany, the senior partner of the Central Powers. In the event that Germany had won World War I, this would be okay, but obvious as we know from history, that did not happen. The victory of the Allies at the end of 1918 led to the occupation of Georgia by the British. This created quite a bit of tension, and the Georgians did not want to work with the British pretty much in any way, shape, or form. They refused to cooperate in the effort to restore the Tsarist imperial order, and ultimately, British forces would be evacuated in July of 1920, as pretty much all hope for support of the whites in the war went out the window. So, at this point, Georgia is fully independent, but they are refused entry into the League of Nations. They are not recognized. Georgia would gain recognition from the Allies in January of 1921, though, but again, this was not something that was going to last, as the government was about to be overthrown. We're really talking a very unstable beginning period here. Within a month, the Communist Red Army, mind you, when we talk about this, this is without Lenin's approval, but under the order of 2 Georgian Bolsheviks, one by the name of Stalin. Yes, that's Stalin, for those that are curious, Mr. Gulag himself. They would enter Georgia and overthrow the government, installing a Soviet regime in its place. After Georgia was established as a Soviet republic, it would be incorporated into the Transcaucasian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, which is a hell of a mouthful to say in the first place, but this is how things worked under the USSR. The still popular Georgian Social Democrats organized a rebellion to try and reassert their authority in 1924, but that was brutally suppressed by Stalin. Yeah, go figure. As I'm sure many of us are aware, Stalin would lead the USSR with a kind of iron fist for decades, from 1928 to 1953. And during this time, Georgia suffered from repression of pretty much all forms of expression of nationalism. You could not be proud to be Georgian. Agriculture was collectivized, and simultaneously, any communists who had pretty much supported Stalin in the beginning, who weren't his immediate closest allies and yes-men, were purged within the first decade or so. Instead, what would happen is that Stalin would install his Georgian comrade, Lavrentiy Beria, as party chief, first in Georgia and later over all of Transcaucasia. Even after Beria was transferred to Moscow to head the secret police, the Republic was something that was never far from the mind of Stalin. It was tightly controlled by the Kremlin. Being a native Georgian himself, Stalin really wanted to see this happen, and from his rule, Georgia would transform from an overwhelmingly agrarian country to a fairly industrial urban one. Now, my friends, when I go and describe all this, yes, I am phrasing things in a rather negative light. I understand that, yes, because this is Stalin, and Stalin did many, many things. Many great things, but also many great and terrible things. Progress was made, but it was oftentimes at the cost of horrible amounts of human life and suffering. Either way, the result was still pretty impressive. In the post-war period, after World War II, Georgia was perceived as one of the wealthiest and most privileged of the Soviet republics, and many Russians would treat the country's Black Sea coast as a kind of Soviet vacation spot in retreat. This would continue even after Stalin's death, but of course changes would happen during that time. Nikita Khrushchev would become the leader of the Soviet Union, and he implemented a policy of de-Stalinization. Now, his purges and the removal of old Stalinists, this is something that was actually not popular in Georgia, considering how this was a, well, not hotbed, that's not the right term. This was a key area of control for Stalin and specifically his followers. And his purges were met with riots in Tbilisi that had to be dispersed by military force. Stalin was a Georgian, and he did enjoy some popularity there, even with his more severe methods. This violent turn of events would compromise Georgian loyalty to the Soviet Union, and that is something that the population would never really forget. It would contribute to the nation's consolidation and eventual rejection of Russian control as the years went by. Now, my friends, I am not going to go over every single event, but I have to kind of explain this because I am showing specifically how it is that Russia has a long history of interfering in Georgia, and things get really spicy going into the 1970s. When the issue of language comes up. See, Russia wanted Russian, as you can probably imagine, to be a language for higher learning within Georgia. And the Georgians, well, they said no. Not only did they say no, but they protested and even fought back against the Russians in 1978. And this is something that, mind you, when we talk about the Soviet Union, that is not something that was just done. And yet Georgians did it, they succeeded, they made sure that the Russians actually backed down. Which is amazing, and at least they did succeed for that one. However, future events were not so kind to them. Throughout the remainder of the Soviet period, Georgia's economy would continue to grow, though increasingly over time it would exhibit blatant corruption, which was already very common within the Soviet Union, but within Georgia, especially considering how wealthy it was in comparison to other parts of the Soviet Union, you started to see more of that here. Increasingly, the government became more and more alienated from the people that they were ruling over. This, my friends, is the problem that the region would face going into the beginning of perestroika, which, for those curious, this is the period of reform that the Soviet Union tried to launch in order to be able to fix itself. In 1986, the Georgian Soviet leadership proved to be so incapable of handling the changes that most Georgians, and mind you when I say this, this includes the everyday rank-and-file communists of the country, they concluded that the only way forward to fix their nation was to break free from the existing Soviet Union and govern themselves. Now, there were multiple events that helped to create this feeling, but the key event in the period leading up to Georgia's modern independence was the horrible event that took place on April 9th, 1989. This being when Soviet troops would brutally suppress a peaceful demonstration in Tbilisi, and 21 people would get killed, the majority of which were actually just women. The events of this day were so severe that it would discredit the Communist Party of Georgia and would galvanize the launching of Georgia's first free elections. The people were not just going to sit by and let this happen again. In fact, when I go and describe this, my friends, these elections that Georgia ends up happening are not only Georgia's first free elections, they are the first in the entire Soviet Union. It is a really big deal, and something Georgia, for decades, has been immensely proud of. As a result of these elections, it was the Free Georgia Coalition, led by Zviad Gamsakhurdia. And oh dear God, I know that I'm going to butcher literally all these names as I try and say that. I am sorry, I know over the course of this video I've been having problems. This coalition would go and secure victory in this election, and from there would form a new government. On the 9th of April, 1991, shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Supreme Council of Georgia would declare independence after a referendum held on the 31st of March. So there it is that you have it, my friends. This is the reason why I had to explain all this. Georgia is free from Russian Soviet oppression, and everyone got on with their lives in a peaceful utopia where nothing ever went wrong again. Right? No, dear God, remember, this is the history of everything, and after all, it gets worse. Which I know I'm not wearing the shirt for right now, but you can support me by buying that shirt in my merch store. As it stands, Gamsakhurdia's rule was very short-lived. He was deposed in a bloody coup d'etat at the end of the same year he was elected in 1991. After him, Shevardnadze, a former leader of the Communist Party of Georgia and then Soviet foreign minister under Mikhail Gorbachev, he would return to his country as the de facto leader in March of 1992. What followed this point was the country becoming embroiled in a civil war, which would last until December of 1993. Regional and ethnic disputes within the two regions of Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, would erupt into widespread interethnic violence and war, which would lead to the death of many thousands and the displacement of hundreds of thousands. Ethnic Georgians who lived in Abkhazia would fight largely on the side of the Georgian government forces. Meanwhile, ethnic Armenians and Russians would largely support the Abkhazians, and from there, it gets really messy. The separatists would receive support from thousands of North Caucasus and Cossack militants, and from the new, not Soviet, Russian Federation. This is important when I stress this here. It is not the Soviet Union any longer, it is the Russian Federation. It is the new independent Russia, and it is something that almost immediately from the outset would begin interfering with its neighbors around it. With Russian aid, Abkhazia and Ossetia would achieve de facto, but not quite full independence from Georgia, with the Georgian central government still retaining control of small areas in the disputed territory. But yeah, thanks to Russian interference, they weren't able to actually reclaim the territory that they considered to be rightfully theirs. And that is something that was going to stick with and anger the population for many years. But wait, there's more. As one can probably imagine when I go and describe this, the complete collapse of your economic and political system, followed by a bloody civil war, is something that can take quite a toll upon your economy. And oh boy, did it in Georgia's case. According to the World Food Program, which looked at the situation in 1999, the collapse of the former Soviet Union would severely adversely affect the Georgian economy, primarily by completely cutting off its export links to the traditional markets that had served it before when it was part of the Soviet Union. Economic activity in many of the sectors came to a complete standstill in 1994 to 1995. When you go and look at industrial production in 1996, this would completely collapse to just 14% of what it was 7 years prior in 1989. Along with that, unemployment throughout the country would surge. As in other ex-Soviet countries, a much larger proportion of women than men were affected by this and became unemployed, since the sectors that women were previously employed in, such as the state industries, the light manufacturing, and public sector activities, this being things such as education and health, they were completely gone. Because of the drastic cutbacks resulting from economic stagnation and funding drying up, there was no money to pay them, so they lost all their jobs. By the end of September of 1998, the trade deficit with the country had widened, with exports standing at $143.9 million, while imports were $746.8 million. The country was burning through every bit of cash that it had. Coupled with this, the Russian ruble crisis of mid-1998 would only make things worse. The general level of poverty was exacerbated and would further cause an additional fall in exports. The government became so incredibly ineffective that by 1998, only 30% of the entire state budget was being dispersed and actually utilized because they didn't have a source of revenue to back any of it. Delays in the payment of state salaries and allowances would become commonplace. And throughout the second half of 1998, salaries for the majority of public employees were just straight up not paid. At the time that I'm describing this is only 26 years ago. Things were really bad, and the government seemed to be incapable of doing anything. Yet still, somehow, they hung on. In April of 2000, Shevardnadze would win the presidential election amidst allegations by Western and Georgian observers, including the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, of widespread irregularities and fraud, something that was going to become quite commonplace in elections to follow. While the government could seemingly do absolutely nothing, or anything that they did do was ineffective, the economy would continue to deteriorate, and Russia, during this time, would repeatedly threaten an invasion, allegedly in pursuit of Chechen militants, which, if you remember the video that I did on Chechnya, yeah, that is something that was happening here at this time. Georgia's economy was stagnating. Its performance was incredibly poor, with GDP growth of only around 2% per year from 1997 to 2002. Which, for a developed country that is rich, that is not bad, necessarily, but the bigger issue is that with a poorer country, this is something that is very bad. It cannot keep up with population growth and leads to further economic trouble. Official unemployment during this time was over 17%, and unofficial or underemployment was even higher than that. People were unhappy. Corruption was rampant within society and the government, and you would think now would be the time to easily vote out the rulers of the country, right? Yeah, you would think that, except you would be wrong, because this is a post-Soviet country, and election rigging is all too common. However, this time, the attempted election rigging was the last straw. The opposition would first demand that the Central Election Commission, the CEC, announce the results. When the commission didn't want to do this, the opposition instead declared that it had won instead and staged massive demonstrations. In response, Shevardnadze would threaten to use force and called for his supporters to surround the presidential offices in Tbilisi, but very few people ended up volunteering for this. Ultimately, he would be overthrown in what would become known as the Rose Revolution. Following the Rose Revolution, a series of reforms were launched to specifically strengthen the economy as well as the country's military. Along with this, there was a movement made to specifically reorient the foreign policy more towards the West and Europe. Now, as you can probably imagine, that is not something that is pleasing to Russia. The westward part, not the reform part, though arguably that is something as well. Side note here, I should mention this because we are skipping past years of issues at this point, but corruption during this time did not just go away. Like everything wasn't going to be magically fixed after the new elections in the early 2000s. The former Justice Minister, Mikhail Saakashvili, would be elected president, and immediately when he was elected, he would open a campaign against corruption, and from there try to stabilize the economy that had been flatlining. The country was rife with ethnic strife, and this is something that had to be addressed. But the issue that comes from all this here is that Saakashvili's campaign against graft and corruption, it didn't seem to be, well, all that free from corruption itself. He was commonly criticized for focusing specifically on the opposition, while corrupt practices were allowed to persist amongst his own party and administration associates. You know, the whole "a rule for thee, but not for me" kind of deal. Which, yeah, we're going to skip past quite a bit of that, because the Russian issue is going to be more important, but this is the thing that you have to understand. This is a very common theme within Georgian politics that has been going on for literally decades. You see, when we talk about Russia, the conflict between Georgia and its breakaway regions never fully went away. Although in mid-2004, Saakashvili did succeed in forcing the leader of the Autonomous Republic of Adjara from power and return the republic to central government control, hostilities would still continue in the territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which over time would continuously receive some military support from Russia in order to be able to harass Georgian forces. And as you can probably guess, that continuous harassment is going to eventually lead to a full-scale conflict. So it is then that in August of 2008, after a series of clashes between South Ossetian militia and Georgian military troops, that Saakashvili would order his troops to capture the South Ossetian capital of Tsikhanvali. Again, probably butchering the pronunciation of all that. When this happened, Russia would very swiftly respond by moving its troops to the border and conducting airstrikes on Georgian positions in South Ossetia as well as Abkhazia. Accusing Georgia of, quote, aggression against South Ossetia, Russia would begin a large land, air, and sea invasion of Georgia under the pretext of peace enforcement. This would be an operation that would begin on the 8th of August. The moment that all of this happened, the entire world was watching, and you would expect at this point that perhaps the European powers, the United States, someone would do something. But no. With the United States, Great Britain, and NATO calling for a ceasefire, the conflict continued for 5 days, as Russia would quickly take control of Tsikhanvali and would roll its tanks and troops all the way through Ossetia into Georgia, stopping only 30 miles from the capital of Tbilisi. And despite calling for a ceasefire, the world did nothing to stop it. No one wanted to provoke Russia at this time. The conflict would go on for 5 days until a ceasefire was called, which would leave 850 Georgians dead and some 35,000 homeless. In the aftermath of the conflict, Russia would formally recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states, but few other countries would follow suit and do the same. Since the war, Georgia has maintained that Abkhazia and South Ossetia are nothing more than occupied Georgian territories. Meanwhile, Georgia as a whole would turn further away from Russian influence in the aftermath of the conflict, and afterwards would sign an association agreement with the EU in 2014, which would subsequently take place at the same time that Russia would take over Crimea. Feelings towards Russia had been bitter before, but now the general population was furious. But this, my friends, is where things get a little bit weird, at least in terms of the story that we've been trying to build here the entire time. At the same time that all this is happening, this is what would lead to the start of the movement that is so incredibly important for our story today, the Georgian Dream movement. See, after the war, Saakashvili would continue to face domestic challenges as political tensions would mount throughout the country. In the year 2012, his party, UNM, would face a challenge from the newly formed opposition coalition, Georgian Dream, or GD. This being something that was led by a billionaire, Bidzina Ivanishvili. That is an individual who is interesting in his own right because he was actually the richest man in Georgia and made his wealth in Russia as a kind of oligarch. Although polls showed UNM with a strong lead several weeks before the October parliamentary election, the party's position was severely damaged leading up to it because, well, years of corruption had kind of taken their toll, and there were many different allegations against them, as well as in September, a video was released that showed Georgian prison guards abusing prisoners, and this is something that would spark widespread public anger. Ultimately, when the election was held, UNM would come in a very distant second against the GD coalition, which would win a whopping 55% of the vote, and from that, 85 of the 150 seats in parliament. Ivanishvili would become prime minister, and GD quickly began investigating and arresting many former government and opposition officials on allegations of corruption. When Saakashvili's term would end in 2013, he would not stick around. He left the country amidst threats that he himself was going to be investigated for corruption. And as it turns out, 5 years later, in 2018, he was convicted in absentia on corruption charges and abuse of power, which of course he denied. This, my friends, is the start of Georgia Dream, and it is so important that I stress this here because this is the party that would come to rule Georgia for the next 11 years, up to this very day in the protest, which I'm going to explain, as that is, again, the entire point of this video in the first place. But before it is that we go any further, I explained how Georgia Dream started, but I have not fully explained what it exactly is or what it stands for, which is kind of important. You see, in the beginning, Georgian Dream officially declared that it was a center-left pro-European party, something that would pursue integration with the West, something that was very popular with the people. However, over time, it moved in a more Eurosceptic, conservative, populist direction. It's not really something that can be pinned down for either side, but what it can be said is that it is more anti-Western and arguably pro-Russian with its foreign policy. Look, it's gonna sound really annoying for me to say this, but the reality for the party is very complicated. Political analyst and a former member of Georgian Dream, Pata Zakarashvili, would describe the party as, quote, undemocratic but not anti-democratic, not Western but not anti-Western, not Russian but not anti-Russian. The party would kind of just do anything and everything, which makes it pretty hard to pin down. Georgian Dream leaders would maintain the party's official goal was specifically for Western integration. They stated that Georgia would become, quote, a member of the big family called Europe with our own identity and sovereignty, end quote. In other words, publicly, Georgian Dream wanted to join with the EU and the West, as was apparent after the Russian occupation of Crimea back in 2014. But it specifically wanted to retain the country's Georgian identity, which voters are fiercely proud of, which is understandable. And don't get me wrong, when I say this, before it is that I go further, I absolutely have to stress this right now. Despite the very real case of voter fraud that we will be talking about here in a bit, Georgian Dream is actually a popular party and has been for years. This is not some minority party ruling over a majority that has been able to seize power and maintain it through false voting methods. As I've already described from the history of Georgia, liberal parties have absolutely failed. They have failed to take root in Georgia due to whether it's conflicting ideology or, more often, just straight up corruption and terrible governance. Past elections are absolutely littered with failed liberal parties, whether that was the Free Democrats, the European Georgians, the Republicans, etc. All of these groups failed horribly. Saakashvili's United National Movement, the UNM, the party that had been in power before, they were more pro-American and pro-European, something that the population liked, but they weren't very liberal in their government or their treatment of people, as, you know, the fraud and force and brutality would demonstrate. In comparison to that, Georgian Dream's more anti-progressive policies are something that actually appealed to a larger swath of Georgians. Their anti-LGBTQ legislation, their defense of Georgian sovereignty against Western interference, their partnership with the Georgian Orthodox Church to defend the traditional family, and even the idea of pushing forth peace and civil order over globalization is something that has appealed to a large swath of Georgian society. Even if you want to make the argument that they are pro-Russian and the population is anti-Russian, which is something that should upset people, their policy has not necessarily been subservience to Russia, it has just been a policy of not trying to piss Russia off. And as Russia is their largest and most powerful neighbor, that is arguably a kind of common sense policy that people would look at and understand. Georgian Dream maintains that their relations with the state are still very valuable, and as such, they want to normalize those relations. As just one example of this, in terms of normalization of relations, during the 2012 election campaign, where they first got power, the party vowed to restore economic relations with Russia that had been damaged by the 2006 Russian ban of Moldovan and Georgian wines, citing the importance of the Russian market for Georgian citizens that were working in the wine industry. That is because if you go and look at it, Russia was responsible for literally 90% of the total wine exports from Georgia before the ban. So once these wines were banned, there you go, 90% of the market, gone. That is going to hurt the economy. Within the population, even if they did not like Russia, there were very real desires for peaceful relations, and this came to deliver victory after victory for the party. Georgian Dream would win the parliamentary elections in 2016 with 48% of the vote, while UNM would receive only 27%. As a result of the mixed proportional majoritarian voting system, this meant that Georgian Dream actually obtained a supermajority of 115 out of 150 seats. That is 77% of the legislation. Or no, wrong word. Legislative body. That's what I mean. They controlled parliament, and as such, could do pretty much whatever it is that they wanted. As the party over time gained more and more power, it would replace pretty much every higher level of administrative position with someone who was either dependent upon the party or was part of the party itself, securing their position even more within society. And that, my friends, is where we start to get more voter irregularities. This is a crucial part to understand for the 2024 elections. The largest part of support for Georgian Dreams specifically comes from the more rural areas of Georgia. Rural voters are dependent upon more local patrons, with those being the mayors, the local officials, all the varying different people who would supervise property acquisition or administer taxes. Along with that, school directors, local businesses, judges, any of these different officials within society, all of them and their positions would be held typically by those affiliated with or part of Georgian Dream. This creates a severe dependence upon the party, and that dependence is amplified around election time by deals, different promises of land, promotions, bonuses, or just straight up bribes in order to be able to vote for them. If people don't vote for them, that is something that can create a little bit of a problem, because the state is the dominant employer in the region, and local governments under Georgian Dream, they are the people who pay the salaries and provide financial support for anyone who is unemployed or sick. In fact, if we are going to describe this brutally and accurately, the system of local government for rural populations more so resembles a corporation, with dependent and powerless employees being in a kind of debt to the authorities, whether that being a literal financial debt or just owing favors, which in turn is something that is returned with the buying of votes. This gives Georgian Dream the leverage that it needs to maintain this system. Now, the accusation that I am making there is quite severe. I understand that, and so you're probably looking at me right now and you're wondering, okay, where is the proof of this? Well, look, as just one example of when this happened, in the 2018 presidential election, Salome Zurabishvili, who was an independent candidate that was actually backed by Georgian Dream at the time, she won in a runoff with 59% of the vote and became the country's first female president, which was pretty impressive. But the thing is, days before the runoff took place, Georgian Dream would go and announce that a charity run by Ivanishvili, remember the guy who was the billionaire, the richest man in Georgia and founder of Georgian Dream, that he was going to buy the debts of 600,000 Georgians. Yeah, if that seems suspicious, yes, it does. It sounds a lot like bribery. And when you are bribing 600,000 people out of a population of under 4 million, that is going to give you quite a bit of sway and voting power. This is what I'm talking about when I say a system of debts and leverage. But it is moving into the year 2019 that it seems that the party may have become a bit too arrogant, and a shift in attitude began to take place amongst the populace. The catalyst for this was the seemingly increasing pro-Russian stance that the party was taking, which was exemplified by the IAO meeting of 2019. Now, this is going to require some clarification, but on the 19th to the 23rd of June 2019, a Inter-Parliamentary Assembly on Orthodox, this is the IAO, this is something that was set up to be held in Tbilisi, Georgia. For clarification, the IAO is a transnational interparliamentary institution that was founded back in 1994 by the Greeks in order to try and unite Orthodox Christian lawmakers around the globe. Both Georgia and Russia are part of this organization. And on the 20th of June 2019, an IAO session would begin in the Parliament of Georgia. Attendance by Russians at this event is not necessarily a problem, it's more so of a matter of who attended and what was said. And in this case, Sergei Gavrilov, a Communist Party member of the Russian Duma, which is their legislative branch, would go and visit and open the session. He would sit in the chair reserved by protocol for the head of parliament and would give a speech in Russian about Orthodox Brotherhood of Georgia and Russia. Now, for those of you who are listening to this right now, that may not sound so bad. I mean, we're talking about a guy speaking of brotherhood within a religious organization, and that is something that does make sense. But here is the issue. Earlier in his career, Gavrilov had voted specifically in favor of the independence of Abkhazia, the breakaway region that Georgia wants to maintain control of. He was not well liked in Georgia, and his presence there and actions were seen as insulting to Georgian sovereignty. After all, he was a representative of an occupying power in the chair of the head of parliament. In response to this, the opposition would go and occupy the speaker's tribune, demanding the Russian delegation to leave, after which the session was suspended and Gavrilov would have to leave the parliament building. In the aftermath of this, the opposition would then call for public protests, which they would get. Protests would pop up all across the capital, and even after a brutal dispersal of them by riot police, further protests would continue to target the ruling party, demanding resignations and electoral reform. Some of these demands were eventually conceded, including some top-level resignations and electoral reform for the 2020 parliamentary elections. But even after these things took place, protests would still continue for weeks. Eventually, though, things would blow over. But 2020 would see another major political crisis, as just like here in 2024, there were mass accusations of the election being rigged. You see, my friends, when the parliamentary election was held in October of 2020, Georgian Dream, once again, won the popular vote. But this time, they lost around 25 seats under the new electoral system that was in place. The UNM and alliance partners accused Georgian Dream of foul play, of voter fraud during the election, especially intimidating voters, buying votes, stuffing ballot boxes, and much, much more. If y'all remember what already happened here in 2018 with the whole paying of debts, yeah, some things happened. Protests were organized to oppose the results in the weeks that followed, and the UNM and other opposition parties refused to participate in the new parliament. It was a very intense time, and that is the state that Georgia would find itself in moving through 2021 and 2022. This being when everything would hit the fan, when Russia would finally go and invade Ukraine. You see, my friends, for context leading up to all this, in 2021, both Georgia and Ukraine were preparing to formally apply for EU membership by 2024. They were hoping to join the European Union by the 2030s. However, with the launching of the invasion, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova would all jointly apply for EU membership in February and March of 2022 to speed up the process. You would think that everything would move forward smoothly, but not quite. On the 23rd of June 2022, the European Council would grant Ukraine and Moldova the status of candidate for ascension into the EU, but it didn't allow Georgia. It deferred candidate status until certain conditions were met and political reforms took place. See, all that funny business that had been happening in Georgia for the previous, at this point, 25 years with all the messy things with its politics, bribery, corruption, and everything else, that is something that the EU didn't really appreciate. And so the European Parliament would go and adopt 3 non-binding resolutions criticizing Georgia. On the 9th of June 2022, the European Parliament would issue a 6-page resolution accusing the government of eroding press freedoms in the country. It also went and recommended that the European Council go and sanction Bidzina Ivanishvili for, quote, his role in the deterioration of the political process in Georgia. Along with this, they would call for the release of former Georgian president Mikhail Saakashvili on medical grounds to be treated in a special institution abroad. For those who are confused right now, yes, I did say earlier that Saakashvili did go and leave the country. He did. After the end of his presidency, he would go and leave the country and was sentenced in absentia in 2018 by the Tbilisi City Court for a variety of things. Embezzlement, abuse of power, a lot more. He categorically denied these charges, and what is interesting to note is that a day prior to the October 2021 local elections, Saakashvili would actually sneak back into Georgia from Ukraine, where he would then call for his supporters to gather in the capital after the elections, and from there he would join them. But the same day that he did this, his location was revealed by the police and he got arrested. In response to this arrest, in detention, he began a hunger strike for 50 days, which would cause his health to rapidly deteriorate. And from there, that is where the whole European Council calling for his release comes from. The third resolution, though, this is something that was passed on the 14th of February 2023, in which the Georgian government and Bidzina Ivanishvili were accused of mistreating Saakashvili in prison and would again call for his release from prison and personal sanctions on Ivanishvili. The Georgian Dream Party, as you can probably imagine, were not happy with the resolutions and criticized them immensely. Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili would call them, quote, irresponsible and offensive towards our people, with another member of the party saying, and I quote, we won't give up our dignity to get candidate status. No one will intimidate Bidzina Ivanishvili or the Georgian state with the threat of sanctions, end quote. Relations were tense, and as you can imagine, it is from here that Georgian Dream would drift even further away from Europe, leading us right into 2024 and the elections that spawned this video in the first place. But first, something really needs to be pointed out. In 2023, Georgian Dream's relation with Zurabishvili, who was the female independent president that we mentioned here earlier, the one who came to power and then afterwards the whole paying of debts things happened. Relations between her and Georgian Dream became increasingly strained over time, especially with Georgian Dream's attempts to strengthen relations with Russia and Zurabishvili's attempts to strengthen relations with the European Union. The party attempted unsuccessfully to try and impeach her in October of 2023 after she made unauthorized trips to several EU countries as well as Ukraine. Her visit at the time would help to secure candidacy status for Georgia to accede to the EU, a status that was announced in November of 2023, only around a year ago, with there still of course being recommendations that Georgia go and reverse their trend towards authoritarianism, something that had been happening this entire time as I've already described. Tensions would rise throughout 2024, and ultimately, it would come to a head at the end of the year with the election. Leading up to parliamentary elections in October of 2024, Georgian Dream would promise that it was going to continue talks to join the EU. And supporters of the ruling party even would hold rallies where some people would sport flags that would combine the emblems of Georgian Dream and the EU. So yeah, they were really pro-EU, it seems, at least publicly. Still, the election was widely regarded as a choice, either pro-Russia or pro-EU. And Georgian Dream would even say, over the course of it, that victory for the opposition meant that they were going to get invaded, just like Ukraine. Now that is a fear tactic. The result of the election? Well, that is what made this video in the first place, my friends. Georgian Dream won, and immediately, accusations of rigging were launched. In the immediate aftermath of the election, Georgian and Western outlets would report many different instances of irregularities. Ballot stuffing, intimidation of journalists, violence in polling stations, attacks on the Unity National Movement headquarters, compromised voter privacy with cameras being set up all over the country to watch people as they voted, and many more things. A coalition of Georgian civil society organizations monitoring the election would then go on to accuse Georgian Dream of undertaking, quote, a complex scheme of election fraud and called for the annulment of the election results. Now, these are very severe accusations. And you may be looking at me right now and you're wondering, do we have immediate proof of this happening? Well, no, not quite yet, but there are signs. As an example of what it is that I'm talking about, on election day, the polling and analytics company Edison Research would conduct a post-election survey of almost 15,000 voters in 115 polling stations. According to their data that they gathered, Georgian Dream was supported by only 41% of the electorate, not the 54% that they said that they won. Other prior polls would paint an even worse picture for the ruling party, with results actually below that seen in the 2020 parliamentary elections. Yes, this is a little suspicious, but keep in mind when I say this, we will give the benefit of the doubt. Exit polls are obviously not perfect, and they can easily get skewed by chance. You never really know the exact people that are going to come out, because you could get a large proportion of voters that are not going to vote for the party that come out and are interviewed. You don't really know. What is more difficult to hide, though, is voter turnout and methods of voting. That is where the real suspicion lays. See, data from the State Election Commission, prepared by the Electoral Graphics Portal, shows that voting machines were used in 2,255 of the 3,101 constituencies within Georgia. For those who are curious, these machines count the votes and then send the results directly to the Capitol. And in most cases, machines like this are pretty much impossible to manipulate. They're direct one-to-one things. But what is interesting to note is that Georgian Dream typically fared far worse in locations where voting machines were used compared to those where votes were counted manually. This is the first real point of suspicion, but it gets stronger when you go and look at voter turnout. You see, my friends, a German newspaper by the name of Die Zeit would draw two curves depicting the voters' behavior on the Georgian elections. You would have one that would represent the urban voting districts, and the other, the rural voting. In large cities, the distribution of votes is relatively plain. It's unremarkable. It follows the general trend that one would expect from the total average. However, in rural areas, there is an unusually high number of districts where the ruling party's vote count is significantly higher than the national average. Now, when I go and describe this, we are talking about rural locations, many without voting machines, where up to 90% of eligible voters showed up and voted for the party. 90%. I want you to keep in mind that voter turnout for the total election was around 60%, which by all accounts is pretty good, if accurate, because the US in 2024 had around a 59% voter turnout. But for places to have 90% voter turnout is insane. Generally speaking, that does not happen. This pattern, already seen many times in different Russian elections, is usually an obvious sign that votes are being manipulated. A Georgian investigative portal by the name of iFact would later go and release a report documenting what was called implausible vote surges for Georgian Dream in several districts. Now, that being said, purely statistical analysis is not something that provides absolute, concrete proof that election fraud has taken place. But at the same time that this data comes out, there have been numerous different reports of incidents at polling stations, people trying to buy votes, thugs going in and intimidating voters, people walking up with ballots, just straight up boxes of ballots and stuffing the voting boxes. All of this adds weight to suspicion. For everyday Georgians, it was obvious what happened. And as a result, protests. Lots and lots and lots of protests. Now, when I go and describe this, the protests themselves have come in two waves. The first wave immediately took place after the election and was largely focused on the results of said election being fraud. This is what you would normally expect. On the 28th of October, tens of thousands of protesters would rally in the capital to protest. In the weeks that would follow, opposition leaders announced that protests were going to be daily and that they would intensify over time, and urged supporters to gather all across Tbilisi in large numbers in order to stop parliament access and to maintain visible pressure on the authorities. Their action plan that they would launch included demands for repeat elections, non-recognition of the new parliament's legitimacy, and also the launch of a coordinated resistance movement that would start in the capital and from there expand all over the nation. Within a few weeks, on the 17th of November, protesters were calling for new elections and would go and establish a tent camp outside of the State University of Tbilisi, which would be dismantled by police on the 19th of November. At least 16 people were arrested in the violence, and that same day, President Zurabishvili would file a lawsuit at the Constitutional Court of Georgia asking for the election results to be annulled, citing, and I quote, widespread violations of voting, universality, and ballot secrecy. The lawsuit, though, was rejected by the court on the 3rd of December. With nothing really changing, the new parliament would go and hold its inaugural session on the 25th of November, this being with only 88 MPs from Georgian Dream in attendance. That's it. They are the only people out of 150 that even bothered to show up. Zurabishvili would boycott the session, while protests would continue outside the parliament building. And that would continue until things really hit the fan on November 28th. You see, my friends, these are the rounds of protests that are still ongoing today. This is what has people even more angry. On the 28th of November, the new convocation of the Parliament of Georgia would confirm the government of Irakli Kobakidze. The official program was titled, and I quote, "Towards Europe with Peace, Dignity, and Prosperity," which the ruling party had adopted as its slogan during the pre-election campaign, with an emphasis on joining the European Union while still maintaining Georgian rules. On the same day this would happen, the European Parliament would pass a resolution demanding that new elections take place in Georgia, quote, "under international supervision." It would also call the European Commission to impose sanctions on the leaders of the Georgian government, which recently were actually vetoed thanks to Hungary and Slovakia. So that is something that happened very recently, if you're curious. Either way, that same evening, the Georgian Prime Minister would hold a press briefing. He would announce the unilateral suspension of EU accession, as well as rejecting any budgetary grants and loans from the EU until the year 2028. He would further go on to say that acceptance into the EU, as well as grants, have been used as a, quote, "naked instrument of blackmail." He condemned any interference by European politicians, as well as their alleged, quote, "attempts to incite revolution in Georgia." Still, he wasn't calling things off entirely, and he did say that Georgia would continue to try to join the EU, but it would not do so until after 2028. Hours later, Russian President Vladimir Putin would praise the move, saying he, quote, "admired the administration's courage and character, which they showed when defending their point of view." Yeah, if Putin is praising you for something, it's probably not something that is going to go over very well with the globe. And as you can imagine, protests immediately were launched, and have only escalated since across the country. For over 2 weeks, and at this point 3 weeks by the time that this video actually goes out, protesters and police have fought one another with melee weapons and fireworks against rubber bullets and fire hoses. Hundreds of people have been arrested or injured already, with no signs of the violence slowing down. If anything, it has escalated. As time goes on, it then brings up the question of whether or not Georgia will experience a revolution, just as Ukraine did in 2014, in which its pro-Russian leader was ousted. On December 8th, 2024, Salome Zurabishvili would meet with US President-elect Donald Trump, as well as French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris. There, she would emphasize the need for a strong US and expressed gratitude for Trump's support, calling him a friend to the Georgian people. She would also, at this time, meet with Elon Musk and describe the exchange as being positive. Fast forward a few days, and on December 13th, Georgian Parliament would approve a bill prohibiting the wearing of masks and the use of fireworks as well as laser pointers during protests. This, as you can guess, is specifically to target ongoing protests and will likely do nothing except give more justification to the police to arrest people and utilize violence. The new legislation would also introduce stricter regulations on fireworks in Georgia, requiring a license for their export, import, or sale. Meanwhile, Georgian Dream has warned the current president, Zurabishvili, that she must vacate the presidential palace in Tbilisi by December 29th. This being the day that the new president, a guy by the name of Kavalishvili, a former football player from Manchester City, of all things, and other football clubs in Europe, is set to take charge. And no, I am not kidding, that is actually what is set to happen here. As it stands, no one knows where Georgia is going to turn. Considering the amount of upheaval that we have already spoken about in Georgia's past, the corruption, the voting fraud, everything, anything at this point could happen. The government is not likely to back down after delaying things to the EU. Opposition parties and protesters are not just going to give in after years of the same corrupt thing happening over and over and over again. Russia is unlikely to look away, as this is something that is right on their border, and it does not want a repeat of what happened in 2014 in Ukraine again. Whether things will end peacefully or in revolution, really only time will tell. But my friends, this has been Stakuyi with another History of Everything podcast episode. I appreciate all of you for joining us today. Thank you for watching, and let me know in the comment section below if there's something else that you would like for us to cover. We are looking at more issues as more things seem to be happening, as the world just does not want to seem to frickin' calm down. Oh dear God, the amount of things that I have to create are piling up. I will see you all here next time. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, buy my merch, and goodbye, my friends.